Okay. No, we're done. We're done. You're under arrest. We're going. We're done. We're done. I said we're done.
As the confrontation escalated, the truth began to unravel.
The Bodycam footage does not begin with chaos. It opens with something far more unsettling. Certainty. A certainty rooted not in law, but in hierarchy. From the first moments inside the hospital, the officer's posture is already fixed. His objective is narrow, his patience thin, and his interpretation of authority rigid. He is not asking whether he can obtain a blood sample. He is operating as though the answer has already been decided elsewhere. The hospital, the patient, and the law itself are treated as obstacles to be navigated, not boundaries to be respected. This distinction matters, because the entire confrontation that follows is not driven by confusion. It is driven by refusal. Refusal to slow down, refusal to reassess, refusal to acknowledge that police authority inside a hospital does not function the same way it does on a roadside or at a crime scene. The nurse understands this immediately. Her language is careful, procedural, and grounded in policy that mirrors statutory law. She is not improvising. She is not escalating. She is doing exactly what her role requires, protecting a patient who cannot protect himself. From the outset, the officer frames the situation in binary terms. Either he leaves with blood vials, or he leaves with a body. That framing is not accidental. It reveals a mindset in which compliance is the only acceptable outcome, and any resistance, no matter how lawful, is reclassified as defiance. This is the first and most important power shift in the video, because it establishes the logic that will later justify an arrest that has no legal foundation. Inside the hospital, authority is distributed differently. Physicians, nurses, risk officers, and privacy officials are not subordinate extensions of law enforcement. They operate under overlapping but distinct legal obligations. The nurse articulates this repeatedly, and each time she does, she narrows the legal question with precision. Warrant, consent, or arrest. None exist. The patient is unconscious. He is not under arrest. The officer admits he does not have a warrant. These facts are not disputed. They are acknowledged out loud. And yet, they are treated as inconveniences rather than dispositive limits. What follows is a textbook example of escalation psychology. The officer's initial request becomes a demand. The demand becomes a threat. The threat becomes justification for force. At no point does the underlying legal deficiency change. The facts remain static. Only the officer's tolerance for resistance erodes. This is how authority misuse often unfolds, not through explosive rage, but through incremental hardening. Each refusal from the nurse is interpreted not as lawful compliance with her duty, but as a personal challenge to the officer's command presence. Crucially, the officer does not claim exigent circumstances based on immediate medical risk. The patient is already receiving care. There is no evidence that blood alcohol levels will dissipate in the short window required to obtain a warrant. Even the officer acknowledges there is no urgency. This admission quietly dismantles the legal scaffolding he later relies upon. Exigency is not declared because it exists. It is invoked because it is useful. That distinction becomes fatal to the officer's position later, but in the moment, it is masked by confidence and repetition. As the standoff continues, the nurse does what institutional actors are trained to do when faced with conflicting directives. She escalates internally. She contacts supervisors. She brings risk management and privacy officers into the conversation. Each layer of hospital leadership reinforces the same conclusion. No warrant, no blood draw. This is not obstinance. It is consistency. The nurse is not acting alone. She is acting as the voice of an institution that understands the liability and ethical breach that would follow unlawful compliance. The officer, however, interprets this institutional alignment as obstruction. This is where the video reveals something deeper than a misunderstanding of implied consent law. It reveals an inability, or unwillingness, to recognize that other systems possess independent authority. The hospital's refusal is reframed as interference with a criminal investigation, even though the investigation itself does not legally authorize the action being demanded. When the officer begins invoking supervisors of his own, the dynamic shifts again. The presence of a lieutenant on the phone does not clarify the law. It amplifies the threat. Authority is now being stacked vertically, not to resolve ambiguity, but to overpower resistance. The message becomes clear. Compliance will be achieved not through legal correctness, but through enforcement muscle. The nurse's demeanor remains unchanged throughout this phase. She does not argue emotionally. She does not insult. She does not grandstand. She explains, repeats, and defers to policy. Her calm becomes a mirror that reflects the officer's impatience. The more controlled she remains, the more stark the imbalance appears. This is not a battle between two equal actors. It is a confrontation between someone tasked with care and someone determined to assert dominance. The Bodycam captures the moment where the officer's language crystallizes into ultimatum. Either the nurse allows the blood draw, or she will be arrested. This is the precise point where the encounter crosses from coercion into abuse of authority. Consent extracted under threat of arrest is not consent. Compliance induced by fear of jail is not lawful cooperation. The officer's own words establish this. He is not enforcing a statute. He is leveraging the power of arrest to override institutional safeguards. At this stage, other officers arrive. Their presence does not de-escalate the situation. Instead, it normalizes the threat. No one intervenes to reassess the legal basis. No one pauses to question whether the arrest statute being cited actually applies. The absence of internal challenge is as important as the officer's actions themselves. This is how systemic failures manifest, not as conspiracies, but as silence. The nurse explicitly requests support. She asks for someone to stay with her. She expresses fear. These are not dramatic appeals. They are procedural responses to an unfolding crisis. Yet they are met with indifference. The system has already decided whose authority matters more in this space. The hospital's layered safeguards collapse under the weight of uniformed presence. Throughout this escalation, the patient remains unseen, unconscious, and silent. His rights are being debated in his absence, yet he is the only person without representation in the room. Ironically, the nurse, accused of obstructing justice, is the only individual actively advocating for those rights. This inversion is central to understanding the gravity of what unfolds next. By the time the officer declares the arrest inevitable, the legal reasoning has fully detached from reality. The statute cited does not apply to the nurse. The investigation does not justify the demand. The supervisor's approval does not create authority where none exists. What remains is pure command logic. I have been told to do this, therefore it must be done. This is the most dangerous form of policing. Not malice, but obedience without comprehension. Not corruption, but certainty without constraint. The officer's repeated insistence that he is following orders becomes a shield against accountability, even as it exposes the fragility of the decision-making process that led him here. As the camera continues to roll, the inevitability of the arrest becomes palpable. Not because the law demands it, but because the officer has cornered himself psychologically. Backing down would require acknowledging error. It would require recalibrating authority in front of civilians. And so, instead, the system chooses force. The tension that builds through these early moments is not loud. It is procedural, methodical, and chilling. The viewer understands, long before the handcuffs appear, that the outcome has already been decided, not by law, but by momentum. The rest of the footage will simply reveal how far that momentum is allowed to carry. When the arrest finally comes, it does not arrive as a sudden explosion. It arrives as paperwork made physical. The officer's voice is controlled. His movements are deliberate. This is not a loss of temper. It is the execution of a decision that has been building since the moment his authority was first questioned. The nurse is informed she is under arrest for interfering with a criminal investigation. This charge, stated plainly, carries an implied legitimacy that the footage itself does not support. Interference requires an unlawful act that materially obstructs police duties. What the camera shows instead is a nurse following hospital policy that aligns with statutory law. The distinction is not subtle, it is foundational, yet it is ignored. As the officer moves to take her into custody, the imbalance of power becomes impossible to ignore. The nurse does not resist. She does not flee. She does not argue. She asks to speak. She asks for administrators. She asks for help. None of these requests are granted. The machinery of arrest has been activated, and once activated, it consumes everything in its path. The physicality of the arrest is jarring precisely because it is unnecessary. There is no threat to officer safety. There is no exigency. The nurse is handcuffed in a hospital corridor, surrounded by colleagues and patients. The environment amplifies the humiliation. This is not a back alley or a traffic stop. It is a place dedicated to care. The symbolism is inescapable. As she is escorted away, the nurse repeatedly expresses pain. These statements are audible, clear, and unambiguous. The officer does not adjust his grip. He does not pause. He continues. This moment is critical, not because of the level of force used, but because of what it reveals about institutional empathy. The arrest is not just about enforcing authority. It is about demonstrating it. In the aftermath of the arrest, the officer attempts to retroactively justify his actions. He references implied consent laws, fatal crash investigations, and departmental directives. Each justification is presented as though it resolves the conflict, but none address the central flaw. Implied consent applies to drivers, not to third-party medical professionals. The nurse was never the subject of the investigation. She was the gatekeeper to a patient's body. The arrival of higher-ranking officers does not correct the error. Instead, it compounds it. A lieutenant confronts the nurse with confidence that borders on condescension. He asserts decades of experience. He speaks in absolutes. Yet his explanations reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of the very laws he claims to know. Experience, in this moment, functions not as wisdom, but as armor against doubt. The nurse responds not with indignation, but with documentation. She references printed policy. She outlines the conditions under which blood can be drawn. Her approach is methodical. It is also futile. The conversation is no longer about law. It is about control. The lieutenant's repeated interruptions and dismissals signal that the decision has already been made. What makes this sequence especially disturbing is the casual normalization of arrest as a problem-solving tool. Rather than resolving the legal disagreement, the officers choose to remove the person raising it. This is a profound inversion of justice. Disagreement with police interpretation becomes grounds for detention, regardless of accuracy. As the nurse sits in the patrol car, the camera captures the aftermath in fragments. Conversations continue. Justifications are exchanged. The blood draw, ironically, is never obtained in the manner demanded. The very objective that justified the arrest evaporates. This detail is crucial. It demonstrates that the arrest was not necessary to advance the investigation. It served no investigative purpose. Its function was purely disciplinary. The footage then shifts into a broader institutional response. Supervisors speak in measured tones about policy and liability. There is a growing awareness that something has gone wrong. Yet even here, accountability is deferred. The nurse is released without charges. No immediate apology is offered. The system retreats quietly, leaving the individual to absorb the trauma alone. When the video becomes public, the reaction is swift and unforgiving. The clarity of the footage leaves little room for narrative control. The officer's own words dismantle his defense. The nurse's composure undermines any claim of obstruction. The visual record does what internal reviews often fail to do. It exposes the gap between authority and legitimacy. The legal consequences follow a familiar pattern. A settlement is reached. Money is exchanged. No admission of wrongdoing is formally made. This transactional closure stands in stark contrast to the emotional and professional cost borne by the nurse. Her arrest becomes a symbol, circulated widely, dissected endlessly, and remembered long after the legal paperwork is filed away. The officer's career does not survive the scrutiny. Termination follows. Appeals fail. Official letters describe conduct as unreasonable and disrespectful. These words, understated as they are, represent a rare institutional acknowledgement that authority was misused. Yet even this outcome raises uncomfortable questions. Why did it take public outrage for accountability to occur? Why did internal safeguards fail so completely in the moment? The lieutenant's consequences are quieter, but telling. Demotion replaces termination. Experience mitigates punishment. The hierarchy absorbs the shock unevenly. This disparity reinforces a central theme of the footage. Accountability is not distributed equally, even when responsibility is shared. As lawmakers revisit implied consent statutes, the incident is reframed as a learning opportunity. Clarifications are issued. Boundaries are restated. Yet the law itself was never unclear. What was unclear, or ignored, was the willingness of officers to accept limitation. The reforms serve as acknowledgement not of ambiguity, but of failure to adhere. The nurse, in a final act that contrasts sharply with her treatment, chooses to use her settlement to support transparency. She directs funds toward helping others obtain Bodycam footage. This decision reframes her role in the story. She is no longer just a victim. She becomes a catalyst for visibility. The footage ends not with resolution, but with residue. Careers altered, trust eroded, systems exposed. The question that lingers is not whether mistakes were made. It is whether the structures that allowed those mistakes have meaningfully changed. In the final analysis, this incident resists simplification. It is tempting to isolate blame on a single officer or a single decision. But the footage, when examined carefully, tells a more complex and unsettling story. It reveals how authority, when insulated from immediate consequence, can drift from law into assumption, and how institutions, when confronted with that drift, often default to protection rather than correction. At the center of the confrontation is a fundamental misunderstanding of role boundaries. Law enforcement operates with significant power, but that power is not universal. Hospitals are governed by medical ethics, privacy law, and patient rights that do not dissolve in the presence of a badge. The failure to respect this separation is not a technical error. It is a conceptual one. The officer's repeated assertion that he is just following orders echoes a familiar refrain in cases of institutional overreach. It shifts responsibility upward while preserving action downward. Yet lawful orders cannot exist in a vacuum. They must be grounded in statute and context. When orders conflict with law, obedience becomes misconduct. The nurse's experience illustrates the vulnerability of professionals who occupy liminal spaces between systems. She is neither suspect nor civilian bystander. She is a licensed caregiver with legal obligations that sometimes require saying no to police. The footage shows how ill-prepared law enforcement can be to navigate this reality, especially when denial is interpreted as defiance. The psychological impact of the arrest extends beyond the individual. It sends a message to every hospital worker watching. Compliance is safer than correctness. That message is corrosive. It incentivizes silence over advocacy, expedience over ethics. When systems reward submission and punish resistance, even lawful resistance, the consequences ripple outward. The legal doctrine invoked throughout the incident, implied consent, becomes a symbol of how law can be weaponized through misinterpretation. Stripped of nuance, it is treated as a blanket authorization rather than a conditional framework. The footage demonstrates how repetition can substitute for accuracy, especially when reinforced by rank. One of the most striking elements of the video is the absence of malice. The officers involved do not appear animated by personal hatred or vendetta. They are calm, procedural, and confident. This is precisely what makes the incident so dangerous. It shows how harm can be inflicted not by bad actors, but by ordinary ones operating within flawed assumptions. Accountability, when it arrives, is fragmented. The officer loses his job. The department pays a settlement. Laws are clarified. Yet none of these outcomes restore what was lost in the moment. The nurse's sense of safety in her workplace is compromised. The public's trust in institutional competence is shaken. These losses are intangible, but they are enduring. The Bodycam footage serves as both evidence and warning. It documents not just what happened, but how easily it happened. There were numerous off-ramps available: pauses, consultations, warrants. Each was bypassed in favor of escalation. This pattern is not unique to this case. It is endemic to environments where authority is rarely challenged and even more rarely corrected in real time. The reforms that follow, while necessary, cannot address the cultural underpinnings revealed here. Training can clarify statutes, policies can be rewritten, but unless there is a parallel commitment to humility, to the idea that authority has limits and that those limits matter, similar incidents will recur. The nurse's final role in this story is perhaps its most instructive. She does not seek retribution. She does not retreat into anonymity. She leverages her experience to expand transparency. In doing so, she reframes the narrative away from victimhood and toward systemic awareness. This is not a story about blood vials or hospital corridors. It is a story about how power behaves when it is challenged by principle. It is about the cost of conflating enforcement with entitlement. And it is about the quiet courage required to say no when saying yes would be easier and safer. The camera eventually stops recording. The conversations end. The paperwork is filed. But the lesson remains suspended in the footage, waiting for each viewer to confront it. Authority, unchecked, does not simply err. It escalates. And when it does, the damage extends far beyond the moment of arrest. In that sense, this incident is not an outlier. It is a case study, one that reveals not just what went wrong, but how easily it could happen again.